starting off this countdown, we have the wrong turn. So this is a real story reported by 4 university students. Their names were never disclosed to protect their identity. But apparently in May of 1972, they were on their way back from a Utah rodeo and headed to their dorm. On their way back, they decided to take a shortcut. But that was their first mistake. While traveling along this unknown road, the path suddenly turned into gravel, and then all of a sudden they hit a dead end. So they had to travel all the way back down the road that they just came. However, while doing so, they noticed that the path had changed. It didn't look like the same original path that they originally took. All of a sudden, they saw something glowing in the distance. They drove towards it and found themselves at a weird building with a neon sign. The neon sign was in a language that none of them recognized. When they pulled towards the building for help, these weird tall men came out towards them. They seemed confused and angry. One got close to the car and one of the girls screamed. The tall man didn't appear to be human, so they sped out of there. While driving away, they saw weird egg-shaped vehicles following them. They sped until the vehicles stopped following them. Finally, they somehow reached the road that they were originally on. To this day, they believe that they somehow traveled to another universe through that road. Isn't that creepy? Hit that thumbs up button if you agree.
At number 9, we have the Beatles ain't dead. These were the claims of James Richard after he took a trip down Abbey Road and ended up in a parallel universe where the Beatles were still kicking. To start off, I have to say that James Richard is not this guy's real name. He uses a fake name so the powers that be won't find him. But his story goes like this. He says that him and his dog were going for a stroll through the Del Puerto Canyon in California, and then out of nowhere he fell through a hole in space and time. He woke up in another version of Earth. He was in a hospital bed and there was a man named Jonas sitting next to him in the bed. And then Jonas started to give him the rundown on interdimensional travel. Through their discussions they started to talk about music, and it turns out that Richards was in an alternate version of Earth where the Beatles were still alive and cranking out tunes. James Richard even brought back a cassette tape with the music of this living Beatles band. The cassette was called Everyday Chemistry, and it sounds like he just spliced together some Beatles songs and some Wings songs, but who knows, maybe this is what the Beatles would have sounded like if 2 of their members never died. At number 8, we have the Dobbses. Frank and Althea Dobbs were the leading minds in a new scientific practice called chaos science. It's the idea that consciousness could possibly be its own universe. They started to pick up some steam and some other people decided to join their cause. They moved the team to a ghost town of Ong's Hat, New Jersey. Here they started to do research on interdimensional travel. I have to say this does sound like a cult. Well, cult or not, they claim that they've succeeded in this practice. It's said that they found a wormhole which led them to a parallel version of Earth that never had been consumed by humans, and they chose to stay there. Considering the state of the planet right now, I would say this was a very good choice. At number 7, we have Whose Life Is This? You go to sleep a happy lady and then you wake up and you're back with your ex-boyfriend? This sounds like a bender that you wish didn't happen, but for Lorena Garcia, this wasn't that at all. She woke up in her bed and she noticed a bunch of minor details were off. The setup of her room was a little off and her sheets weren't the ones that she loved. Never mess with a lady's sheets. Then her ex-boyfriend walked into the room, but the crazy thing is, it wasn't her ex. They never broke up and they were still together. After this she was like, okay, this is crazy, but I gotta go to work. So she went into her job and she had a different job and a different boss who was someone she had never seen before, and she couldn't explain any of this. At number 6, we have Riverside Down. I don't know how you can go through an interdimensional portal without noticing it, but apparently this happens quite a bit. Carol Chase McElhenney was driving through Cali when she decided to take a short trip to her hometown of Riverside to see how things never really change. It can always be a little bit of a shock to go back to where you grew up, but this time things had changed a lot. Actually, everything had changed. The layout of the town was the same, but all the houses were different. The home she grew up in was warped. She was concerned that she had taken a wrong turn, but she found her old school which she went to, which was exactly where it should be. But then she started noticing strange figures around the town, people who looked a little off and definitely creepy. This was enough for her, and then she sped out of there. She returned returned to this town at a later date and everything was back to normal, but she never forgot that time she slipped into a parallel dimension. At number 5, we have interdimensional cabin. No, this isn't another movie pitch from me, although this would have been an amazing movie pitch. There's a cabin in the Markawasi Stone Forest that is said to open up a door to a different time. Some women were hiking through the woods and they saw some people outside this cabin dancing and lighting torches. Before you run away in fear, they weren't lighting torches to get all angry mob, but it was because they didn't have any sort of modern technology. They were all dressed in clothes that looked like they were pulled out of the Spanish Golden Age. The people dancing eventually entered the cabin and the women went to investigate. One of the women walked halfway into the cabin and her friend grabbed her and pulled her out. She immediately fell to the ground and couldn't move half of her body. Half of her body was paralyzed. The women ran away, and some people speculate that the reason the woman couldn't move half of her body after she entered the cabin is because she entered another dimension halfway and then was pulled out, which caused her body to get all screwed up. I don't really know if there's good science on this. At number 4, we have what road is this? The crazy thing about all these stories is how calm people are when they get transported to another world. Pedro Olivia Ramirez was driving through Spain and was headed to the town of Alaca de Guadarira. This was a drive he could do on autopilot. He had done it so many times before, but this time something went terribly wrong. He made a usual turn that should have led him down a small road, but he was suddenly on a 6-lane highway. He didn't recognize any of this at all, and everywhere around him there was these buildings that seemed like they were pulled from another world. Eventually he pulled off the highway, and to his surprise he ended up in Alaca de Guadarira. He tried going back to find this highway, but he never could. See, if that was me, I would be swerving all over the road and then would pass out from a panic attack. At number 3, we have a wrong turn. When you go on a road trip, you probably want to go cross country, not cross dimensions. There were 4 girls driving through a desert in Nevada, and out of nowhere things started to get a little strange. They saw street signs that had an unknown language on them. They didn't have any sort of markings of any alphabet that any of them could recognize. So what's the best course of action when you end up in a strange neighborhood? Well, you ask for directions, you silly little goose. So they saw some dudes hanging out in what looked like to be a truck stop diner, and they drove up beside them to ask them where they were. But then things got strange. These guys started to freak out, and it didn't take long for the women to realize that these guys were humanoids, but definitely not human. So they hightailed it out of there. This is when they started to get followed by some oval-shaped vehicles. The girl driving slammed on the gas, and she must have pushed it up to 88 because then they were back in Nevada, and the oval pursuers had vanished. At number 2, we have the Children of Woolpit. This story is bonkers. We're going back to the 12th century. Everyone in the town of Woolpit was chilling and doing a bunch of farm stuff and just trying to survive. You know what it was like back then. Then 2 kids came walking into town. They had green skin and spoke a gibberish language. The people took these kids in because they're kids and they seemed like they were terrified. They fed them, but the kids would only eat beans. Then not long after this, the boy of the 2 died. But the girl lived on. She eventually learned how to speak English and told everyone that she was from another world, somewhere where the sun never rose and it was perpetually twilight. She said she was on her father's farm and heard a crash, and then she was in Woolpit. She never found out where she was from, but she did eventually settle down and start a family. And for the number 1 spot, we have Shadow of a Doubt. Interdimensional travel is apparently impossible because space-time bends matter and light, but because of this bending of light, there is a chance that we could see shadows from another dimension. This could have been what happened to a young woman who was living in Massachusetts. She said one night she saw a shadowy figure appear in her room out of her closet. The figure moved close to her and then was followed by another. And then another. Some of them were wearing strange clothes, and one of them seemed to be wearing glasses. Then they started to surround her, and she did the smart thing and hightailed it out of her room. Of course, you're not going to stick around with the ghost things. There could be the chance that these were some sort of beings peeking in from another dimension. At number 10, we have I Flew In From Taured. Going to another universe sounds good, but you have no idea what's going to be on the other side. Maybe it's going to be really simple. Maybe it's a universe where everything is the same, but everyone's left-handed. Or maybe it's a reality where the Nazis won the war and O.J. Simpson leads a fighting force in America against the Nazi forces. Well, the man from Taured probably wished he stayed back in his universe. It was 1954 and a plane just landed in Tokyo. Everyone was getting off and everything seemed normal. But then one dude halted everything. Custom officials ran out and started investigating this one guy. He had all his documents, but he was from a country that didn't exist. It was a place called Taured. The man in question said that it was a very real place and that he had flown from Taured to Japan many times. At first glance, this guy seemed to be a whack job. But then the crazy thing was that all his paperwork was legitimate. He had official stamps on his passport to back all of his stories and claimed that the country of Taured was squeezed right in between France and Spain. The custom officials in Japan were stumped, and I understand why. There isn't anything in the training manual about how to deal with interdimensional travel. So they escorted him to a hotel, and he was not allowed to leave until the problem was sorted out. 2 guards stood outside of his door, and he was on the 15th floor, so there was no way for him to sneak out of the building. In the morning, the guards went in to take him out for more questioning, and the dude was gone. He disappeared like a fart in the wind, and that was the end of the story. I guess he didn't like how strict we were in our dimension.
In our number 9 spot today, we have infinite universes. Piggybacking off of that last point, we have the fact that there just might be even more universes. Like, not just more of our kind of universe, but more of the universe. The Big Bang started off our universe, but it was not the beginning of everything. The Big Bang, which we all know happened when? 13.8 billion years ago, was the first time the universe could be described as hot, dense, and full of matter and antimatter and radiation and all of that. But there was stuff going on before that happened. Prior to the Big Bang, there was a period of cosmic inflation. This inflation leads to the growing of space-time, and this means that if that period occurred for an infinite amount of time, there could be an infinite amount of universes that are all finite, and one of these universes happens to contain ours. Does that make sense? This video really is all a person needs to feel exceptionally small and very insignificant. In our number 8 spot today, we have daughter universes. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far. Let's try and make this the universe where this video has the most likes. Let's do it. This one is just a theory about if there are multiple parallel universes that exist and what they contain. This is where the theory of daughter universes comes into play. It is possible that multiple universes may follow the theory of quantum mechanics, which is how subatomic particles behave. Following the laws of probability, the daughter universes happen when you are faced with a decision. In our reality, you make your decision and it plays out one way, but in the daughter universes, they would each involve you making every other decision you could have made in that moment, which would then lead to whatever outcome that decision would have ended up leading to. This just means that there may be a universe for the opposite of every decision you've ever made in your life, and one for every decision anyone has ever made. How likely is this? I'm not sure, but if we ever find a way to jump to other universes, there goes the days of regret. In our number 7 spot today, we have bubble universes. For this one, we need to imagine our universe as a bubble, which it kind of is. The swelling bubble of our universe is just one bubble among many. Well, as we all now know, it is possibly just one among an infinite amount, all of which are swelling and expanding. All these bubbles make up the multiverse. This itself is of course just a theory that was made in an attempt to understand the origins and beginnings of our universe, but now it is being researched further. Physicists have begun studies on how and when universes might collide and bubble up together. I do understand that this is not concrete proof or evidence, but we wouldn't be researching it if it wasn't a possibility. This research could potentially lead us in the direction where we get to see some real proof, or at the very least, give us a better understanding into the theories of how multiple universes exist and how they could potentially interact with one another. In our number 6 spot today, we have the lack of evidence. This evidence is more so about the lack of evidence there is to say that the multiverse doesn't exist. Many scientists find the idea of the multiverse alarming or even unscientific because of the fact that there's no way for us to test for it. There is no way to make predictions that fall in line with data, and no way to really verify its existence, whether it's one parallel universe or an infinite amount. But there isn't really any evidence or data to support the theory that we are the only universe that exists. If our universe was created basically out of happenstance, what could stop another universe from being created at the same time or out of a similar happenstance? The idea and theory of the multiverse itself is relatively quite young and new, so it is possible that we will find the evidence to persuade most of us to one side or another, but as of right now, anything is possible. And maybe in another parallel universe, we already know all about the existence of this one. Maybe there's another me watching me make this video being like, oh, you don't know anything. In our number 5 spot today, we have the cold spot. The cold spot was first discovered in 2004, and it is basically just what it sounds like. It's an area in the universe that is slightly colder than that surrounding it. And when I say slightly, I really do mean very slightly. But when I call it an area, I'm talking about a huge one, as it is around 1.8 billion light years across. It was first believed that this area may be colder due to a lack of galaxies, but a newer study suggested that that is not possible, which led researchers down a different path in search of new theories as to why the cold spot exists. One of the most exciting is the theory that this may have occurred due to a collision between our universe and another bubble universe. A bubble universe is what we just spoke about in the last part, and they make up the multiverse, which would be the uncountable realms that all sit side by side, but that are in higher dimensions than our senses are able to interpret. This, of course, is a theory, and it will require a lot of time and research before we can say for certain, but it truly is kind of crazy to think that a huge, colder area of the universe could be due to a bump-in with another universe entirely. In our number 4 spot today, we have the CMB. After the Big Bang, it took around 300,000 years for things to cool down enough in order to allow atoms to form and to allow light to travel freely. This was known as the recombination, and during this time, that is when the cosmic microwave background began. The CMB is electromagnetic radiation that fills all of space, and while the space in between stars and planets and such may seem to be completely dark, the CMB is there and can sometimes, through sensitive enough technology, be seen as a kind of glow. So, how does this play into what we're talking about today? Well, scientists noticed a sort of bruise on the CMB during research, which left them wondering why. This is what led to this next parallel universe theory. If our universes are all like bubbles and one bumps into the other, it's possible that they may merge, even just for a second. This could cause some parts of one universe to spill into the other before eventually parting ways again, but this collision surely would leave some sort of a mark. And that mark just may be the bruise we saw in the CMB. In our number 3 spot today, we have the CMB Part 2. So you know what the CMB is now, and there's another thing we are looking for in it that might give us a sign of the multiverse. We thought we found evidence of this back in 2014, but it may have been a false detection, but we continue to look. Gravitational waves, which are ripples in space and time, are what we are looking for right now. The waves would have been left over from the Big Bang, and they could be putting tiny curls into the CMB. If found, this would prove the theory of cosmic inflation, which we discussed close to the beginning of this video in number 9, which would then lead us to the creation of multiple universes. It's all linked together in the most insane ways, but the universe is very cool and very complex. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Mandela Effect. So, thinking about what we just talked about with the bruise and the CMB, and if our bubble universes really did collide with some other universe, and they had a moment where they may have been interconnected in some way, then this would explain the Mandela Effect. If you don't know, the Mandela Effect began being widely recognized when people began to swear that they could remember Nelson Mandela passing away in the 1980s. This is of course weird since he actually passed away in 2013. This time discrepancy had people obviously confused, and it has happened with many other things such as the Berenstain Bears, the movie Kazam, and honestly a whole bunch of things. There are many theories as to why the Mandela Effect happens, and one of them certainly is the belief in multiple universes and some sort of crossover happening between the two. This, coupled with the possibility of colliding universes, is hard to comprehend, but it does kind of make sense. In our number 1 spot today, we have the strange particle. This might be the most concrete evidence, but we still don't really know what it means. This evidence came to us originally in 2016, but it took a few years for it to be interpreted in the way that might suggest the potential of a parallel universe. During experiments and research in the Antarctic, researchers captured what seemed to be the signal of a high-energy particle. This would be all well and fine, except for the fact that instead of coming down from above, this particle seemed to be exploding out of the ground. Despite multiple attempts to explain why the signal was appearing this way, scientists were left with not a lot of options, and one of those has to do with the fact that this strange particle just may be proof of another parallel universe that is both exceptionally similar, but also the complete opposite of our own. In order to explain this particle, there would need to be the existence of another universe that was created during the same Big Bang that created our own and exists in parallel with ours. But this universe would have to be a mirror of our own, where left is right and right is left and positive is negative and time runs backwards. It's both the most simple and most complex idea that all started with one tiny, strange particle. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the infinite versions of our universe. Okay. Let's start off at the beginning. Well, the beginning of what is our observable universe, which was the Big Bang that happened 13.8 billion years ago. This is when our observable universe was born, which is finite, but the universe itself, which our universe is a small part of, is infinite and could have been born infinite. Since we can put a timeline on when our universe came into existence, which is that 13.8 billion years we just talked about, we can place a timeline on the things in our own universe. Everything in our universe is finite. But beyond our universe and the stars and galaxies and matter and all of that sciencey stuff is the universe, which would lead us to believe that there are many more infinite universes that are just like our own, but that are beyond our knowledge because of the fact that the speed of light, as well as the beginning of ours, the Big Bang, is finite. If there is an infinite amount of universe out there, then it only seems reasonable to believe that the same sort of creation of our finite universe happened an infinite amount of times.
In our 9th spot, we have the lift ride and the disappearing store. Just recently, Reddit user NoBookkeeper3991 decided to take a lift to go to the dollar store. It wasn't too far from his place, and it wasn't complicated to get to. A couple minutes go by and he should have reached the store by now, but they couldn't find it. The store just randomly wasn't there anymore. In fact, the whole street looked different. Both the dude and the Lyft driver started to panic. Everything changed in front of them in a flash. It was super weird. So yeah, the guy didn't end up going to the dollar store that day. Apparently, they rode into a parallel universe or something. And of course, days later, the missing dollar store magically reappeared again. Moving on at number 8, we have the disappearing professor. A well-known faculty member at the University of the Andes disappeared on campus without a trace. According to multiple witnesses, they saw the professor leave one of the university's buildings, cross the parking lot, and get into his car. Many people saw this happen. In fact, people were calling at him and waving to him as he got into his car. But his car sat there unmoving for a while. A couple of students actually approached the car to see what was going on and found the car empty. The professor was nowhere to be found. To this day, the professor has never returned. It's assumed that when he got into his car, he was transported to a different universe. Moving on at number 7, we have the Green Children of Woolpit. Back in the 13th century, 2 weird children randomly appeared in the village of Woolpit in England. The 2 were brother and sister and had weird greenish colored skin. To make things weirder, they spoke a language no one heard of, and they were dressed in weird clothing. They also didn't want to eat anything except raw beans. Eventually, they were taken in, but sadly, the boy became sick and passed away. The girl, on the other hand, started to like normal food and started to lose the green color in her skin. After learning to speak English, she said that her and her brother were from a place where people had green skin and the sun didn't shine bright. They were herding their dad's cattle when all of a sudden they heard a loud noise. Bam! They were in a new place. Now the girl ended up growing up and marrying a man and starting a whole new life there. But it seems like the 2 traveled there from another dimension. Coming in at number 6, we have the campsite. A couple of years ago, a woman and her friends were out camping when they heard music coming from the forest. They followed the sound thinking that they were alone and came across a small stone cabin. The weirdest part? When they approached the cabin, they saw people dressed in 17th century fashion. One of the friends was fascinated and went over to the cabin to try and go inside. As she was about to enter, one of her friends pulled her away. As that happened, half of her body became paralyzed, the half that entered the cabin. It's believed that she partially entered another dimension, and that threw off her nervous system, which resulted in half of her body becoming paralyzed. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the deaths. This story is pretty intense, so buckle your seatbelts. But basically, one night this woman had a dream about someone she knew dying. 3 days later, that dream came true and the person passed away. This has happened to her a number of times. She falls asleep, has a dream that someone dies, and in exactly 3 days, that dream comes true and that person passes away. I mean, that sounds like a horror movie plot, like if you agree. Anyways, this has happened to 2 of her colleagues, 3 of her grandparents, her great-grandfather, her friend's grandfather, 2 school teachers, 3 of her friends, and a random lady she met for 5 minutes one day at work. So, maybe don't become friends with her, because then she'll have a dream about you and then you'll die. I'm just kidding. But some people believe that she's actually hopping from different universes. In one universe, the person has already passed away. When she jumps back to her current universe, the person isn't dead yet, and that's what triggers these dreams. They're just memories from other universes that she has traveled to. In our fourth spot, we have the different family home. Back in the day, a woman named Carol Chase McElhenney decided to visit her old family town and area. But when she was driving down her old street, she couldn't find the old house that she grew up in. In fact, all the houses on the street look completely different. She then decided to drive to the street where her grandmother used to live on. But when she got there, she found that the street was completely different as well. She then was driving through the town, noticing that almost everything was changed. Like the cemetery where her parents were buried wasn't there anymore. Or a strip of restaurants and hotels was now just a graffiti-covered area. She started feeling very uncomfortable and drove off. A few years later, Carol's father died and they went back to the cemetery to bury him with his parents. Surprisingly, the cemetery magically reappeared and everything about the town was back to normal. So she believes that during her other trip, she managed to visit her old town from a different dimension. In our third spot, we have the birth certificate. Just recently, Reddit user Professional Echo 348 went to get a new birth certificate. They were at town hall when they saw that their mother's middle name was not right. It was written as Victoria, but her real middle name was Virginia. So she asked the clerk what was up with it. Even her last birth certificate had her mom's middle name as Virginia. Sadly, her mom passed away 17 years ago, so she couldn't just phone up her mom and ask her what was up. Plus, she even named her daughter's middle name after her mom's middle name. So she decided to dig into this some more. She was going through old files when she saw that her mother was once married to a man named Pierce, which again was wrong. His name was actually Pierre, not Pierce. So sometime in her life, she switched universes. One where her mother's middle name was Victoria and her stepfather's name was Pierce. Coming in at number 2, we have the different girlfriend. One day, a guy woke up only to find that he had been sleeping next to some random girl. He freaked out, and the girl, whose name was Laura, was all like, WTF, we've been dating for a couple of years now. How don't you remember? Stop fooling around, this isn't funny. Sure enough, his apartment was filled with framed photos of them together. What's weird is that wasn't his girlfriend. He was dating a girl named Maria, not Laura. So apparently, he went to bed with Maria and woke up beside a new girlfriend, Laura. So somehow he managed to switch universes in his sleep. That is insane. And does that count as cheating? Let me know in the comments below. And in our number 1 spot, we have Lorena Garcia. Lorena Garcia lived a pretty mundane life until one day, everything changed forever. Her life literally got flipped upside down. So she woke up one day and noticed her bed sheets were different than normal. She kind of just ignored it and went on with her day. But as she made her way to work, she noticed little things were off. Again, she ignored it as she arrived at work. But when she got to her department, she realized it wasn't her department. She thought that she was on the wrong floor, but she wasn't. She had worked there for the last 20 years. But today, she worked in a different department. She even looked herself up on her work's database. She worked at the same company, but it said she worked at a different department. Then things continued to get weird. Her former boyfriend disappeared without a trace. There was no sign of him anywhere. There was not even a sign that the two had even dated. In fact, she hired someone to see what happened to him. Turns out, he never existed. At least not in this universe. Her current boyfriend was someone completely different. So somehow, when Lorena went to bed, she managed to travel to another universe. Isn't that crazy? Like, imagine waking up and having a completely new job and partner. I would freak out and probably go insane.